Hello there, everyone. Thanks for making the time to join us this afternoon. My name is Michael, and I'm the events coordinator and publicist at Annie Bloom's Books. For those of you who aren't familiar with the store, we're located at 7834 Southwest Capitol Highway in Portland, Oregon, right in the heart of Multnomah Village. Our bookstore has been around for a little over 40 years, and we're still plugging along despite everything that's going on in the world. Our store is currently closed to browsing, but our website is always open, and you can shop at annieblooms.com day and night. We offer curbside pickup, local delivery, and shipping. And we are delighted to be hosting Kim Johnson, who will be joined in conversation with Mariann Hyland. As many of you probably know, Kim is a University of Oregon administrator and the author of the young adult book, This Is My America. At the university, Kim maintains civic engagement throughout the community while also mentoring Black student activists and leaders. She holds degrees from UO and University of Maryland, College Park. Kim lives her best life in Oregon with her husband and 2 kids. This Is My America is her debut novel. It is billed as The Hate You Give Meets Just Mercy, and an unflinching yet uplifting first novel that explores the racist injustices in the American justice system. You are welcome to purchase signed copies of This Is My America through Annie Bloom's Books by clicking on that purchase link down there. This Is My America. Purchase This Is My America here. We greatly appreciate it. After Kim finishes the reading portion of the event, this conversation here, there'll be a Q&A session. Feel free to use the Ask a Question button down there at that point, and we can do it that way. Once we get to the question portion, I can invite you on the screen, but you don't necessarily have to accept that invitation if you're not feeling up to it, and I'm very happy to ask the questions on your behalf. So no pressure there. We also have with us here Marianne Hyland. She is a University of Oregon alumna, the Vice President of People and Culture at Oregon Community Foundation. She co-founded Driving While Black, the app, a mobile phone app dedicated to helping Black people survive traffic stops, protect themselves from unreasonable searches and seizures, and pursue justice to address traffic stop abuses. Also, she has served on the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility Prison Advisory Committee since 2002. We are going to start off with Marianne. All right.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this live book tour, Kim. I am so thrilled by your book, and I look forward to our discussion about the creative process and for the audience to hear you talk about your amazing book. But before I begin with asking you some questions, I want to mention that we are excited to present this event in partnership with Annie Bloom's Books as the host and the University of Oregon Black Alumni Association. The Black Alumni Association was established to connect Black alumni and provide support to current Black UO students. The organization would like to encourage Black alumni, former students, current students, faculty and staff members, parents and family members of students, and members of the UO community who identify as Black or have a heart for the UO Black Alumni Network mission to get involved with the group. This year, they will be offering a series of virtual opportunities to engage, and you can learn more at the website www.uoalumni.com. And Kim and I met at the University of Oregon when I was in the provost office there a couple of years ago, and she reached out to me to moderate this session today. And I've read her book, and I just want to reiterate, I am honored to moderate this session. And This Is My America is a superb book. Really, it's like none that I've read in the past. It's an affirmation of the reality of the Black experience in America, the enduring legacy of trauma, our undeniable humanity, and the resilient strength and courage we possess to keep moving forward, inspired by faith, hope, and love. So I highly recommend that you read this book and that you gift it to others. So Kim, I'll begin by just asking you about your creative process and what motivated you to put pen to paper and breathe life into the characters, especially your protagonist, Tracy Beaumont, who is such a wise sage.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Annie Blooms, for having me here today. Really excited to have this event at Oregon indie bookstore. That's a prominent location in Portland. And Marianne for hosting me, and of course the U of O Black Alumni Network, which I was a board member previously. I'm no longer a board member, but I love to keep that connection, so I appreciate that. My creative process, I think it's different than a lot of authors who have always sort of identified themselves as writers at a very young age. For me, I've always been a storyteller. I've always been someone who has connected themes and threads, really try to think about breaking down new stories and ideas, whether that's through oratory storytelling or just through my own imagination. And for me, in terms of this particular story, I actually started writing about 9 years ago, inspired by young people. So I worked at in higher ed institutions for almost 20 years. I think that's why I resonate so much with writing young adult literature, is that coming of age experience. I think young people, and we see it today with everything that's going on in the country, they are so resilient. They are filled with hope, promise, and so much of what I want to write about, I want to write about hope, even when I write on themes that are as challenging, as difficult as I did with This Is My America. And so for me, my creative process is imagination. I usually have a very vivid image of what I want to tell. And a lot of it for this story was actually sparked by frustration with the media coverage over the Black Lives Matter movement, and looking at police brutality as just one particular issue that only sort of lives in isolation within itself. And I think for many of us that have known this, and for those that are just learning about these issues, that it is not only a cycle within our criminal justice system, but it's a larger picture about racism in our country that's at the root of our country. And so a lot of my story came from that creative spirit, but also wanting to touch on real life issues. So,
and can you comment a little bit about Tracy, the protagonist, and sort of how she evolved? She's such a wise individual, wrapped up in such a young age, young package. What is it about her that really speaks to you and who you are?
Yeah. Part of her stems from me in terms of my love of finding right and wrong, and wanting to have justice. And I've always had that sort of as the core central of who I am as a young person, from the things from entertainment, being fascinated with mysteries and crime stories and those kinds of pieces, but looking at it from a social justice lens, of what I consider true justice to be, and my activism at a young age. But if I really reflect on my main character, and for those of you that haven't had an opportunity yet to know a lot about my book, she is relentless. She's fearless. She's 17 years old. Her father has been wrongfully incarcerated, and she demonstrates so much in the book of what I actually see with the young people that I work with every single day, whether it's my time at the University of Oregon or when I worked at UC Berkeley and the University of Maryland College Park, where you have young people who see a problem and they want to resolve it, whether that's starting their own organization or whether that's writing letters or whether that's protesting. I think there's a lot of different ways to do it, and I wanted to have a character for young people like that, who have that kind of spirit, that kind of fire for justice, whether that's around issues of criminal justice or whether that's the environment or something that they see within their community, that there are ways in which people like that need to have stories that reflect their lives, reflect their experiences. And I wanted to have something that I didn't feel like I had as a young person, when I was sort of grappling with injustice that I was seeing. And one of the first ones that really sort of drove me with this story was the first time I ever had a strong sense of right and wrong was with Rodney King, and visually seeing that. And then as we continue to see it on and on, you know, as a young person, it struck me so hard of that you know, you just knew that there was something so wrong with it, even if I couldn't articulate it, because, you know, at the time, you know, 92, I was, you know, middle school really, before I even almost into high school. And I wanted to do something, and that started my own activism. So the spirit of Tracy, really came from that. I wanted her to be a young woman because so many of our leaders, are women, are Black women who have been fighting for justice, but often don't get an opportunity to be the sort of the face of justice. Even if we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, very little do we actually see the women, the three women who led those movements. And I wanted a story for anyone, for any reader, but in particular, it was so important to me to have a main Black character, who's a young woman fighting for justice.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, you really can't help but fall in love with Tracy, because she represents so much of what has kept the Black community going, and moving forward. I want to talk to you about this idea of generational trauma. And what struck me when I read the book, and it really, really highlights the trauma that children in particular experience related to mass incarceration, over policing, white supremacy. And, you know, we don't often talk about this in books. You know, we don't see it in literature as much unless it's some sort of a scientific brief or paper. So I wanted you to read a passage that I thought was one of the most poignant in the book. And you and I discussed this in advance, so you're not totally surprised. So it begins on page 269. Beginning with I wish, and then ending with the first sentence on the next page. But I'm wondering if you could kind of frame this up for the reader in terms of what's happening here.
Yeah, so without being a spoiler, because I hate do spoilers, we won't do a spoiler, but much of this book does deal with contact and interaction with the police, and it brings up a lot of history and trauma. We start our story where early on you learn how her father was impacted, how he was brought in when he was suspected of a murder, and how it impacts her brother and his interactions with the police and her interactions with the police. So they're a family that the interactions have not been good experiences for them. So so without going into detail, the police have arrived. And something has occurred that the police are actually there to help her, and this is her response in a chapter called Unthinkable. So my chapters all have chapter titles rather than the traditional chapter numbers. So it's brief too, so I won't talk too long. I wish I could trust them automatically, but I can't. History has a way of latching on to you, like touching a hot stove. You only need to do it once before you know better. When the police arrive, Mama waits by the door, shaking. I meet her, wrapping my arms around her waist. I know she's doing the same as me, putting her armor back on. I know she's doing the same. I gaze up at her, then quickly look away. It hurts to see her forcing herself to be strong, especially when Miss Evans was allowed to fall apart, allowed to be human. When I'm ready, I force myself to study Mama, because I need to learn that strength so I can pass it down, like a family recipe, an heirloom, a curse.
You know, I think that sort of sums it up, you know, just how deep and layered and intricate this idea of trauma is. And I just thought that was a beautiful passage, and I'm wondering, did that take you a lot of time? It's so clear and crisp. Did that take a lot of time to come up with those words?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this was part storytelling, part therapy, part sort of forming the words and feelings that I sort of were experiencing during a time. I started writing this book almost 6 years ago, right after Eric Garner is passing, and thinking about this book. And thinking about how I wanted to try to explain it to my son, who was very young, who caught the video footage on the television screen. And I wanted to be able to explain what that experience was like, because we often don't get it in the page. We often don't get a chance to sort of really connect how that feels. And going back to my thought about media is that the visuals that we see are very brutal in terms of police brutality, but we don't actually get an opportunity to think about all the different experiences and how that connects, not in just that moment, but a lived experience, an ongoing experience where it actually brings fear to you. And, when I write things like that, I do, often I'm in the moment. I'm really, really deep into my characters. I really like to have layered, deep characters. I think about my family members. I think about my friends. I think about the way I want to articulate it, how I'm feeling. And so a lot of that comes into my writing, and wanting to be able to express those. And it sort of hits the heart. I talk about it, it punctures the hearts and minds of readers, and that's what I really hope to do in the moments that I talk about some of the really heavy experiences that happen in this story.
Yeah, that makes sense. Your author's note is superb, and I highly recommend that everybody read that, because when you go through this, it's like a chronology of history, important salient moments. You sum up very complex data, and then you comment about the fact that when you were growing up, there weren't books with protagonists who looked like you. And what I remember, or that you weren't reading them, you didn't have access to them, and there's still a lack of that kind of reading material. And as I was reading the book, there was a piece of me that was kind of grieving the fact that I didn't have exposure to literature like this growing up, and that I wasn't able to share it with my daughter. And then I just thought of the loss that we've been deprived. And your book is such a gift in that way. And I hope that more people start writing. But I wanted to ask you, when you mentioned you started with rap was your source of inspiration, because that's where art was happening with Black people that was visible to you, that you knew about. So you were really inspired by that. And I'm wondering, were there any books that you read at the time when you were younger that inspired you as well, even though you didn't have a lot of choices?
As a young person, honestly, there really weren't a lot of books that I felt represented, in my story. I think, as a college student, I was an ethnic studies major. Once I hit college, I took African American lit, history, politics, law, anything that I could take to understand sort of the historical, political, and sociological perspectives of, being a person of color and an African American in this country. And so a lot of that sort of, I pull to that. I use a lot of nonfiction in my writing. I include a lot of the main resources that I used and was sort of like in my head when I was writing this story. But really, as a young person, I didn't have a lot of that. I think the mystery elements are something that I think takes people by surprise in reading this story, is that it isn't just a story about a family that's going through generational trauma and having been wrongfully incarcerated, but it's a mystery. And if I was to take away anything as a young person, it really was a mystery, and reading mysteries, that helped me jump into a story in a way when I wasn't represented. So I didn't have to necessarily resonate with a character as a young person if I was reading a mystery, because I wanted to solve the mystery. So I cared about solving the problem. And I use that as a way, I think, to anchor my story, so that if someone doesn't actually have the lived experiences of Black people in this country, or people of color in this country, who have who really maybe aren't necessarily aware of it, that there's at least a sense of a mystery, that something happened and they want to figure it out. And it's a way to sort of pull a reader more and more into this story. If I do think about maybe a little bit later about when I think about, I wrote this story, I sort of was looking at my strong feelings about To Kill a Mockingbird, and how that has been used and it continues to be used in classrooms. It's basically diversity and social justice curriculum. It's a key part of the curriculum. And to me, that really represents sort of a white gaze perspective, where as an adult reading it again, I found very little actually dealt with the African-American character in the story. It really was about the main protagonist, the young girl, about how she, experienced her neighborhood and interacted, and that her father just happened to work on this case. And I wanted a story that actually was centered around the Black experience. And that is really what propelled me. It was this, and reading Just Mercy, where I really felt like it was my aha moment that in my writing in adult literature, that I could actually influence the kinds of stories that young people could read all the way up to an adult, and we don't have to necessarily rely on classics. To Kill a Mockingbird is a classic. It was monumental at the time, but as a country, we have moved on from that, and I think there's lots of other works. And I look to lots of other writers. An autobiography of an ex-colored man, I think was a key one for me as a young person thinking about this work. Native Son was another strong element for me in thinking about wanting to tell sort of heartful, tough stories, that we often don't get an opportunity to be able to give our young people. So
yeah, you're mentioning of To Kill a Mockingbird. Is a great segue to my next question. But as I was reading your book, first of all, I don't read murder mysteries much at all. I'm not a fan, but I love the murder mystery element in your book. It was really delightful and so lovely to see Black characters, path breaking in terms of figuring it out and being the smartest people on the scene. That's just so awesome, to see that. I did have some hits of, I found myself thinking about To Kill a Mockingbird when I was reading your book. And because sometimes you use language that I would describe as Southern Gothic style. Some of that. And I think of Absalom. What is the name of the author? I don't know if you've read that, but just the style of writing. You reminded, there were some hints of that Southern Gothic style. So I was wondering if at all you were influenced at all, or it was a response to Kill a Mockingbird, sort of a Black.
Yeah, it wasn't a response. I think it was in the back of my head, but I didn't actually look closely at To Kill a Mockingbird. I think for me, I wanted to write something that actually felt timeless.
Faulkner.
Faulkner, yeah. I wanted to write something that did feel timeless. So even though there are some, there are modern elements, they use cell phones and they're texting and, they're doing those kinds of things. But, for me, I was really thinking that, it is my book, I feel, is as much A Devil in the Grove, looking 50 years ago at Thurgood Marshall's, his experience, as much as it is Just Mercy. And because I feel like these issues, going back to generational trauma, it has been a part of our nation's history. It has not just propped up just because we're sort of now aware of these, innocent cases and other kinds of things. And so for me, I really wanted that sort of element where it didn't feel too contemporary. It was sort of in the middle of feeling historic and classical, but then still contemporary, so that you really couldn't date. You can date it, but you can't necessarily pinpoint like, oh yeah, it was this particular year that the story's about. So
So I found myself thinking about the white savior complex and Atticus Finch, and in To Kill a Mockingbird. And I was waiting as I was reading to see if you were going to describe the race of the lawyers heading up the Innocence X organization. And what I noticed, they were dark-skinned people. And, in law, there aren't as many Black lawyers as we'd like to see. I mean, frankly, Black lawyers were discriminated against in the American Bar Association. They were excluded, they were denied the right to join. Black people didn't start becoming lawyers in any meaningful numbers at all until the 70s, when affirmative action started to help open up these previously segregated universities. And so what I was looking for, because I think those of us who kind of traumatized by always being sort of cast in these subordinate roles in literature, we're always sort of looking for signs that it's going to happen again, that snake in the house, so to speak. So I was looking for, subconsciously, I think at some level, evidence of white savior syndrome coming out in your book. And I didn't see it anywhere. And I'm wondering, did you consciously think about that? Like, let's not have that happen here, now.
It was really important to me that it was centered on Blackness. From every component, even in moments where there are very close friendships and relationships in the story, where there are white characters, it was important to me that they were experiencing and maybe realizing racism either for the first time or in a particular moment, and that there wasn't they weren't part of the ones saving, they weren't the center of the story, even though they were still elements in the story. And I really wanted the main character, to resemble Bryan Stevenson, even choosing his name, Steve Jones, which is the attorney, and his father, Stephen Jones. So it's sort of this father-son aspect in this story. And for me, that was so important because so much of our stories are in that way. Even my selection of having the police officer, where there is a sort of a duo team that are involved, it was important to me that there was a Black police officer, because I think that is a very accurate portrayal for many people in the African American community, is that we so many of us know officers who they are part of our community. There's this sort of like experience that they have to go through, and I even wanted that aspect to sort of own that piece and have that representation in this story. And it also was really important to me that in the story, it did call out things that as a white person, that they should have stepped up and done something. And it's their responsibility. Even if you show the arc of the story, that they actually maybe in some cases did do something, and I think it resembles now the conversations that we're seeing about anti-racism. If silence is violence, all of those different components. I think that was definitely in my realm and in my head. I think especially being a Black Oregonian, where the majority of the people are around me are not Black. And so for me, it also was a calling out of, we are all a part of this community, and it's all our responsibility to address these issues. And when there's a wrong, that there's a responsibility to make it right.
Yeah, you mentioned the Black officer, Beverly.
Beverly.
Yeah, I love the way you addressed the extra challenges that she had related to being part of a white supremacist system, literally, where you highlight how white supremacy has infiltrated these institutions, police bureaus. She walks that line of being part of that brethren, and yet part of the community and bridging the gap, like being the translator. And I just thought, I thought that was very sophisticated, the way you handled that. And I haven't seen it addressed at all in a novel before. And I'm also wondering if you can comment about the engagement of Tracy with, she observes and she comments and she notices white privilege quite a bit. And she has a relationship with someone named Dean, one of her classmates, and who's white, and that friendship. And tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about sort of navigating the race relationships in that regard.
Yeah, so Tracy has two people who are there's three people actually who are very close to her. And, you know, I really wanted to have representation in the story as a Black girl growing up, and then as a Black woman as an adult. I'm married, wonderful husband, family, all those wonderful things. But if you look at media and a lot of other factors, you get these sort of stereotypes or these impressions of strong Black women who don't need anyone, they are independent. They don't actually need a relationship, and not need is sort of like an added term that I'm adding there, is that they don't actually get to have that representation. You know, we expect Black women to be very strong and independent, and we don't have opportunities where you actually see them in relationships. And so it was really important to me that the main character was able to explore that and explore it across race, because often we don't get an opportunity to see that. And I wanted that sort of close relationship where it's a very, very tight relationship to explore race, because again, I think it sort of really comes from my background, you know, growing up in Oregon and having very close friends who are white, and the ones that I feel very comfortable talking about race. And the ones that you know, you don't know how those conversations necessarily go. And I wanted to model that. I wanted to model it, especially with a young sort of our future. Dean is a character who actually, as a white male, isn't afraid to have tough conversations. He isn't afraid to admit racist feelings, thoughts that he has. And work through them in a way that I think, I don't necessarily use the term white fragility, you know, but it's a term that's commonly, you know, used today, is that sometimes that feels too uncomfortable that people don't want to do it. And I think we see it a lot here, you know, in Oregon and other places too. I'm not picking on Oregon. I love Oregon. Oregon's a wonderful state. But I think that we don't do that a lot. And so for me, it was really important to have a main character who is completely independent. She is independent. She actually is very strong. So she does play onto these other areas, but she also has opportunities to explore what she wants and what she doesn't want in a relationship. And so I really wanted to sort of reflect that, because there's such a lack of representation. I wanted to play on, you know, having a love triangle in my story, these things that we often don't get to have Black girls and Black women be able to experience at the center of their story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thought that was great to explore that. I wanted to ask you, as I was reading your novel, you know, you and I took a workshop by the same person, or writing a workshop by same person. And one of the tips that this person gave those of us in my workshop was, when you're writing a novel, start thinking about a screenplay, and then start thinking about actors who would play certain roles, and then create a soundtrack for your movie. And so I'm wondering, have you thought about that? Have you thought about your book being translated into a movie? Have you thought about key actors who you could envision playing certain roles? And what would be on your soundtrack for your film?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Because I didn't grow up feeling like I was a natural born writer. Everything that I actually experience in terms of storytelling is very visual. It's actually very, very cinematic. I write to music. I know, you know, some writers love to do that. Some writers can't. They need complete silence. So I actually I write cinematically. I write in ways that it almost feels like it's third person. I write not third person, but 3 dimensions, sort of like you can almost like feel like you can sort of taste it, but writing in a first person narrative so that you're like really in the head. And so head of the different characters. And so I didn't think of it, you know, in terms of my writing as a screenplay, but I think it definitely reads in that way. And, you know, elements that are very suspenseful, I would listen to soundtrack scores from, you know, big films that have those sort of like heart beating elements. And I would like play the music so loud on my headphones as I'm like writing these very intense scenes, and then choosing songs that that do have that sort of emotional feel to it. Any novel that I'm working on, I actually have a certain kind of music that I only listen to that music when I'm writing that particular work. One, because I'm a more than full-time professional with a family involved in multiple organizations. So the time that I spend writing is actually very, very limited. So it's sort of this trick that I learned from another author about how to trigger your creative brain by having particular songs and music. And so, you know, that's something that I did a lot. And this one had a range. So it was like scores from different, like John Wick. That was actually wrote a lot watching John Wick, because there wasn't a lot of dialogue in that movie, and it was lots of action. And the music was very intense. And so I listened to that. But, you know, I think for this one in particular, I did listen to more, you know, rap and R&B, you know, and that kind of music. And my future books, I have very different sort of sound. My next novel, I'm actually only listening to Miles Davis and John Coltrane, you know, like that is like, I'm just listening to them, maybe some Nina Simone. I'm not even exploring anything, listening to any other music. And so I did play with that. And again, visually, I did choose characters that, you know, were sort of like, I have a Trello board that I use, and I have character plots that I use. And it does help you think about who they're saying, you know, and who those are. And, you know, as I'm writing, sometimes they would age out. And so I would have to swap them out. So, you know, one of my characters actually was Michael B. Jordan. He started out being the brother in my head, but then as he got older, I was like, oh no, he's too old. He has to be Steve Jones. You know, he's going to be that character. And I do that, and it does actually help, you know, in terms of like writing and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What about actors?
Oh, this is a hard. I hate to just say a bunch of names. For the father, I had like Chiwetel, who he's been in, you know, several different movies. He actually was a sort of this father image. Sterling Brown was another father character for me, just because he just is so intense and emotional. Tracy actually was the hardest one for me to. I couldn't, you know, I couldn't actually visualize, because I didn't want her to be a character that I've seen before, because you know, like at one point early on, I think I had the main character, Yara Shahidi from Blackish, just because it was like the only actress that I could think about. But I think if I was to like get, you know, some kind of film deal and they asked who should be Tracy, I actually wouldn't know, because I'd want it to be an up and coming, you know, new person. But yeah, lots. I've got lots, but I won't bore you with names.
In your contract for the film rights, I encourage you to make sure you assert some rights around the soundtrack.
Yeah.
It's impactful and important part of the work. So let me just check in with Michael. How much time do we need to reserve for questions? Because I don't want to short people.
I'm back. Oops, I didn't mean to take up the entire screen here. Let's see. I think we're doing fine. It's 4:41, and do we have questions here? Let's see. If you're ready to start fielding some questions, then we can encourage folks to start asking some questions, because we don't have any yet. But I'm sure that very wonderful discussion between you two will generate some questions right now, right?
I do have one more question for you.
Oh, okay, cool. So people can start thinking about their questions while you're asking.
Yeah, because I think we would be shortchanging this whole discussion if we didn't talk about Jamal. And you mentioned in your author notes that 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated in their lifetime. And so, can you speak to sort of that statistic, the character Jamal, and so how he navigates through the world related to this situation?
Mm-hmm. And with Jamal as her older brother, he has tried to walk a perfect life as much as he could. Knowing knowing what he was able to witness and see through his father's experience. He's a track star at his high school. He runs independently. It's something it's not just because I'm from Oregon that I chose him to be a track star. In the story, it also is because I saw it as the one thing that he could control and do all on his own. He could control the race, and I talk a little bit about that in the beginning. And he's off to go to college. But the reality is that I really wanted, in telling this story, and actually doing something a little bit different with a young adult story, which typically you cover. I could have completely just covered the theme of her father being wrongfully incarcerated. I didn't have to actually tie in both story of father to son, but I really wanted to talk about the generational cycle that impacts communities all over the country because of this cycle. Because if you look at data around those that have been incarcerated, that they are so much more likely to have their children at some point be in a cycle. And if we go back, and I look at my office, if you go all the way back to where did this patrolling, policing occur, and it came all the way from slave catchers. It came from Reconstruction. It came from, after slaves were freed, you could be pulled back into free labor that wasn't covered under the 13th Amendment. And what does that cycle mean? The bias that holds when, who gets a ticket versus who gets pulled in versus who gets a pass. You talked a little bit about the lack of representation of Black attorneys in our legal system, and sort of where that has come through and that has increased. But if you look at prosecutors, 95% of prosecutors are white men. And if you look at bias and discrimination, they're the ones that are able to make the decision on how far do you prosecute. And I researched, I looked at hundreds of materials, from nonfiction works to listening to the stories of wrongful incarceration cases, and so many themes of wrongful incarceration, stories that they're so common. Like you could have pulled, anytime I sort of questioned the story that I was writing about whether or not is accurate, I would then listen to a podcast story where it's a 3-series story where someone is actually almost telling my exact story about how it sort of like got caught up in that scenario. And a lot of that is a targeting. And so it was so important to me to be, accurate in how difficult it is, because once you have that mark, and I talk about that mark is, it could be as easy as if you're pulled over once. And if you look at data all over the country by race, on the percentage of white and non-white people who are pulled over, almost as much as 3 and 4 times pulled over if you're non-white. And if you're pulled over again, sort of that targeting, that profiling that occurs, going into the grocery store, all these things that we see all across the country that people are talking about. There's so many moments in their life, it is so difficult to actually not get caught up. And so that's what we actually see this data of 1 in 3, because if there are these sort of minor scenarios that occur, it's very easy to then get into the system. And we can look, I won't go, on to detail, but if you look at the crime bills or the 3 strikes law that came into California, how that just disproportionately has put so many Black men and women. So that's the other population that's increasing, is Black women and women of color, looking at our school to prison pipeline of how much that, how much that sort of impacts, looks at, rates. You could look at Louisiana specifically. So my story does cover the death penalty, wrongful incarceration, the death penalty. You can look at the state of Louisiana. It actually is, you're 97% more likely to get a death sentence if you are a Black person who has murdered a white person versus versus any other race. All the data is there, and so when I talked about Jamal and wanting to have that representation in this story, I wanted people to actually fall in love with Jamal and see their son, their brother, their cousin, their family member in Jamal, and see how quickly his life could get taken away because he knows it, because he's seen it with his father. And so for me, I like to talk a lot about cycles and how this is all one big cycle that is just not caught up in just one moment, but it's very interconnected in looking at our entire criminal justice system. So.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, are we ready for questions?
We do have some questions now. Let's see if people want to come on screen and actually answer them. Kathy, do you want to come up and ask your question, Kathy Dunn?
Yeah, Kathy. No, Kathy. Kathy doesn't want to do it, you guys.
Okay, I'll ask Kathy's question. She asks, what is your writing process like? Where do you write, and how do you find the time between a busy work and home life?
Thank you, Kathy. Pre-COVID, I'm a very efficient writer because I don't have a lot of time. And so for me, typically pre-COVID, the only time that I really would have opportunities to write would be on the weekends. And so you would find me at the Starbucks or the Barnes and Noble or any kind of bookstore or location that I could be locally. And I would give myself 3 hours. Like, I need 3 hours today. I have to commit to it Saturday. I've got to commit to it Sunday. And, I think for a lot of writers, that would be really frustrating because you want to make headway, or you just don't see that you can do it. But for me, if you're consistent and you do it over time, it actually can quickly come up. And once I actually have a full novel that's there, then I'll take my vacation time and I'll take a week off, and my vacations are just writing. I treat it like a job. My husband will be like, "Aren't you on vacation?" It's like, yes, vacation from work. Now I'm writing. And so for me, that's just that commitment. And so I think for anyone who's exploring writing or thinking that they can't do it, I think just if you do it consistently, you'll be amazed actually at the progress that can occur. For it. And then I just go through just series of iterations of revisions. I'm what you call a pantser. I typically like to jump into a story and just start free writing because usually I'm moved by something. I'm moved by a character. Or I start to sort of get a sense of a story that I want to tell. And then once I've written like 20,000 words or so, I then will start plotting the rest of my story. But I'm not so strict once I plot. Because often these sort of interconnected things occur. I actually see it as almost like a magical experience that it's outside of my own being when I'm writing often. It definitely was how I was feeling in writing this story. I feel like I was propelled to write this story. I put other manuscripts aside because I wanted to write. I felt like it was so important to write this story, and just as its release is coming under one of our largest movements that we have seen in at least 50 years, for me, I feel like that was the reason. So part of my writing process actually is sort of like outside of my own being, is that there's an inspiration pulling me. So.
Cool. All right. Let's see if Shannon Lovell, do you want to come on? Ask your question, or would you prefer I answer it or ask it for you? Answer it for you. Not sure if she's. All right. Well, I'll ask it on Shannon's behalf. The cover is absolutely stunning. Were you able to work with the publisher to bring your vision to life on the cover? And are you happy with the outcome?
Yeah, the cover is beautiful. I couldn't have imagined it to be, any better. And for people who haven't had a chance to actually see the book, I think on the back, is one of my sort of favorite pieces. It's this sort of like representation that was there. My publisher was amazing. They really wanted to have me share, like, what are the kinds of things that I wanted. Did big picture. We went through a long sort of iteration, and adjusted to actually. They identified an illustrator. They decided that might be the best way, because my book balances what people would consider. There's a lot of nonfiction, like not of reality in my story, and we didn't want it to get caught up in it feeling like it was a nonfiction story. Because it is fiction, is to actually have an illustrator. And they found this incredible artist by the name of Chuck Stiles, who actually did this painting above me right here of James Baldwin. And it was his first book cover that he's ever done. And I absolutely loved that his art represents my work, because it feels just fresh and authentic to me. I'm a lover of art, creative and all those different kind of components in wanting that representation. And so they were really great. I wanted to make sure that there was semblance of the flag. At the time that I was writing the story and thinking about the title of my story, I had strong sense of wanting to reclaim the flag. Because I think often as Black people, because we might critique things that we see as unjust or wrong, we're shared that we're not American. We don't believe in America. And James, again, my favorite James Baldwin, like, we love America more than anyone else, obviously, because we would have given up on it a long time ago. And so for part of me, it was representing that. The Black American experience has not been told. Our American experience hasn't been told. And so I think from the title all the way to the cover really represents, what I was trying to do. So loved that experience. I think I'm just felt really fortunate to have been as involved as I was.
Cool. Next question is from Raina Jackson. Let's see. Raina, want to come on?
Come on, Raina.
Is Raina coming on? All right, well, I'll ask on Raina's behalf. You've gotten great reviews on the book. How has the reaction been with your intended YA audience?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting with me is that for a really long time, writing was my secret. It was my thing. I didn't actually have the identity. I didn't feel like I was a writer. I thought was sort of like this person sort of impersonating and trying this thing. And so I kept it from my colleagues, actually, for a really long time. And I thought in the summer it'll come out and I'll just go on vacation and no one will ever know that my book, that I wrote a book. And that obviously wasn't going to work. I think that's been a really big transition for me, is hearing from colleagues. And I think for me now, getting used to embracing it, because, I think a lot of people care about this topic in general. There's people who care about this topic, but I think because it does feel so timely, I think I do have a wider audience reading it. And I do think it's a story of all ages, but in particular, I think one of the most heartfelt things that I have experienced is this week I got an email from a 12-year-old, and I don't know if it was a girl or a boy, or I don't know their pronouns, and they weren't Black, and they wrote this beautiful email telling me how important it was for them to read this story. How they believe that Black Lives Matter, how they believe that all the issues that I talked about were important, and that they want to dedicate their life to making sure that there's justice in the world, and that they want me to live a joyful and happy life. And that's sort of like summarizing that story. And I cried reading that email, because it was the first time that I actually had heard from a young person who took the time to it's hitting me, who took the time to email me. And I'm really, really excited for the fall, knowing that there's so many teachers and librarians and educators who have been emailing me and on social media talking about how they are so excited to get my book into the hands of young people. And I'm so excited about that. And oh my goodness, this is so embarrassing. Take the camera off me. Next question.
Okay, next question. Oops, sorry, that was Raina.
Oh my goodness.
Raina also wants to know, you have a son, has he read it? Has he read the book? If so, what are his thoughts? If he hasn't read it, when do you think you'll introduce him to it?
Yeah, so I wish I had tissue paper in this room. My son hasn't read the book. We listened to the first chapter in the audiobook. And we talked about, so my son, he just turned 13. He's going into 8th grade. My story is aged at 12 and older. Typically YA is 13 and older. And about 30% of the young adult market are actually, 40% of the young adult market actually are adults. And so he's right at that age where I think it'd be appropriate for him to start reading it. And I'm actually really excited because we have a wonderful narrator in Bonnie Turpin. She did, so many stories, that she did the narration of The Hate You Give, If Beale Street Could Talk. She's done so many, and I'm really actually excited to listen to it with my son, so that and then he can read it, because obviously we've got copies here, but to be able to break it down and talk to him about it. So looking forward to doing it this school year now that it's an appropriate age for him. So
cool. Next question is anonymous, I guess. Oh wait, who is this from? Sue H. How can your book put in front of audiences who are older than YA? I am 67, and this is just as valuable for me as if I were a YA. Mm-hmm. I wish I'd read this when I was a YA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hi Sue. I think that's actually a really important point, and I think one of the things that I sort of like always want to emphasize, for me, it's always important, that my number one audience that I center my stories are young adult readers. That is who I wrote it for. And it's going to have those elements of that young person's coming of age experience. But I'm an adult, over 40, who loves young adult books. I think the thing is that although it's a young adult book, it's just the age range of a character. And it's not, it doesn't say that you actually have to be that particular age. And I think one of the beautiful things about young adult work, and I'll claim my book as beautiful too, is that, when you're older, you've been through that experience, maybe not this specific experience, but you've been through that sort of journey where you've identified, work to identify who you are and who you want to be in this world and what is going to represent you, and learning about navigating the world. And I think that everyone can learn from that. And as I look at all that's happening around the country, we have people of all ages who are very engaged in using their voice, their feet, their hands, their power in terms of either protesting physically or protesting, via social media or however they're doing that. But it is young people who are really using their voice powerfully. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn as adults. And I feel like I am constantly learning. I learned how to write as an adult. I learned how to tell a story as an adult. I could take up a new interest 5 years from now. And I think that young people help remind you of that, is that you can always change. And I did write this story because it does deal with a lot of heavy topics. I wanted to make sure that the family was represented. And so I think that as a reader, you might not be a young adult, but I'm certain that people connected with all the different characters, from Corinne, who's the youngest in the story, to the mother and father in the story, and the community leaders who are in the story. And I think that any reader can sort of place themselves in a community and maybe even question, where am I in this community? Who am I when I'm part of, if I was in this story, part of that community? So.
Cool. We just have one last question in here from Denise Milholland. Denise, do you want to come on screen? Should I ask? It's a short question. Did you have to decompress after completing this book?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Did you have to decompress after completing the book?
Yeah, I mean, I had to decompress at many moments. And I do write, I want to just make sure, especially for some audience members who these topics, they hit even harder. It was really important to me that it wasn't just a pain story. So I have lots of laughter and joy in a very strong family, and to me that actually was very therapeutic, because I think that's that the resilience piece of, while there might be hard and heavy things that happen, that there are also other elements. We are more than just our experiences. And so for me, I think definitely decompressing, but I'm so busy. Decompressing is then just moving on to the next item on the list that I have to do, for it and stuff. And I did see, like, someone asked a question about what's on my bookshelf. Yeah. And I have lots of books on my bookshelf. So I'm just going to quickly sort of go through it. The Other Westmore is a really important read. It's fiction. It's about two, it's a story by Westmore, but it's about two men living in the same community with the same name, who have very different experiences, one through incarceration and one through a very successful life. Just Mercy was the inspiration for my story. Dear Justice is about to come out. It's the follow-up by Nic Stone of Dear Martin. And then The Black Kids just came out last week by Christina Hammonds Reed. It's actually a historical fiction set in the 1990s, which is considered historical fiction. And it's another coming of age story about a privileged Black girl who is growing up in, fancy LA community, and learning about the Rodney King trial and the riots that occurred after it. So I've got lots of other books, but those are a lot on my bookshelves right now, and I'll just kind of angle. I've got a lot of that are hiding over there, but there's lots of great recs. I wanted to make sure just to share them, and I'm sure that Annie Blooms carries all of those books that I just recommended.
I think probably so. Yeah. Those are some big ones that we sold a lot of copies of. Kate Ristow, who's a local author, and
hi, Kate.
So those were fantastic recommendations. Nice, Kate. Thanks, Kate. Thank you so much. That was very thoughtful and wonderful, and really great conversation between you two. It was really great to listen to. I think everyone enjoyed it a lot. If we have no further questions from anyone, I guess we'll wrap this up and call it an evening. All right, thank you two so much. This is really great. And again, you can hit this purchase. This is my America Here button and buy the book from Annie Blooms. We have signed copies thanks to the book plates that Kim has sent us in to put inside the books. And we can ship them to you. You can pick them up at the store. We do local delivery within 3 miles. So lots of ways to get the book from Annie Blooms. And yeah, it was great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, U of O Black Alumni Network. Thank you, Marianne. And thank you, Michael, so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.